Hello, everyone. I thought I would do a more in-depth analysis of Crime and Punishment, um, which is one of my favorite novels that I have read. But before we get to that, if you would like to support this channel, um, my book, The Ecstasy and the Ignominy, is available for purchase, um, and it has elements of Crime and Punishment, um, especially involving the character of Desmond Archer and his scheme. It's sort of a subplot. It also has elements of A Tale of Two Cities, um, Anna Karenina, and it's told in a very Melvillian, Shakespearean, Dickensian kind of style. If you would like to support this channel. Um, and I have other books available as well. Um, but anyway, one of the fascinating things about Crime and Punishment to me, though, is how it critiques the arbitrariness in society. And this is a longer version of a video that I have already made as a short. But I thought I wanted to expand on my thoughts, and that is because so very often in society we live by social rules about how we should behave around money. People are after money, status, um, and you see that, for example, in what the character of Raskolnikov's sister is after, where she's marrying solely for the sake of money and status. And it can seem like humanity is very shallow and apocryphal. Um, Things like soulful passion, soulful love, those things are so secondary in many cases in society that it can seem like no one actually cares about love on that level. That we're all, in many ways, secretly just animals, cavemen dressed in modern suits, modern outfits, and all we care about is hedonistic pleasure. We just have a larger vocabulary to describe it. Um, and Raskolnikov realizes this, and it makes him quite cynical. It makes him think, well, the only thing that really matters is power, so why don't I take advantage of that and actually do in the old woman, and try to have make some good come out of it. And it makes perfect sense, actually, from what he sees. What he doesn't see, however, is that there is more to humanity than that, and we live in a fallen state, a fallen world, where that is not always immediately obvious. That the way to regain our humanity is not to commit violence, it is to try to reconnect with God and nature so we can restore humanity to what it was supposed to be. Um, it's about embracing the transcendental. Um, and that is something that many people do not realize, and Raskolnikov does not realize it throughout the majority of the book. And that's what I think the book critiques. It critiques the arbitrariness of society, but it also shows that violence is not really the answer, or and that evil is not the answer. The answer, you can't fight darkness with darkness. That only creates more darkness in the end. You can only fight it with light. You can only fight it by bringing truth into the light. And that is something I think this book does quite well when, because after Raskolnikov commits the murder, he spirals completely out of control into a complete darkness and despair, where he finally realizes partially the truth, even though he's still struggling with it somewhat by the end. Because in many ways, what Crime and Punishment critiques is modernity. It critiques the idea where people are losing touch with nature. This is during the Industrial Revolution. Of course, it's far worse today, where people are starting to view things like religion and spirituality as just completely arbitrary, and that the only things that really matter are power, control, or looking virtuous. That this is often seen, for example, the in Dostoevsky's critique of the elites, looking virtuous, having equality, but only for the sake of moral superiority, not because you actually believe in the intrinsic value of every individual. Um, but these moral philosophies are ultimately built on sand if they have no transcendental foundation. Um, Pure humanism doesn't make any sense because there's nothing within secular philosophy um, that makes human beings intrinsically valuable. Um, you cannot prove that um, through through logic alone, because logic can only tell you, and rationality can only tell you how you can achieve a goal. It can't tell you what you should want. That's a completely different thing. And so Dostoevsky critiques the limit of such philosophies, and he ultimately shows that you cannot really have any kind of objective or transcendent morality without God, so to speak. That it all becomes arbitrary, um, because you cannot the human being cannot be considered intrinsically valuable um, on a secular worldview. You can talk about, oh, well, human beings can survive if we do this, but okay, well, why should human beings survive at all? Um, who's to say which human being should survive? And so it's all subjective unless you actually have a transcendental foundation. And in fact, and Dostoevsky doesn't go into this as much, but he hints at it a little, that even logic itself becomes impossible because logic is built on certain transcendental principles that aren't in and of themselves empirically proven. And so, but if you have a foundation that cannot account that cannot account for logic, then it ultimately collapses because you ultimately cannot confirm empiricism with empiricism. It's entirely circular because the idea, for example, that you should only believe in what can be empirically proven is in itself is in itself cannot be empirically proven, and so it completely falls apart. Um, and and again, if you just say logic just is, well, then you're getting into a fallacy called being arbitrary, where logic is solely the result, where you're saying what just is, well, that's not really an argument. It's basically saying I'm just going to appeal to this just because I can, but I don't actually have a reason for why something the way it is. If you cannot account for it, again, your worldview completely collapses on top of itself. Um, so anyway, I think Crime and Punishment critiques this quite well, but it doesn't do it through philosophy or preaching so much. It does it through drama, through storytelling, because Raskolnikov lives in a world where he thinks that he can be this Superman, this man who can just kill people and not follow the rules, but then he realizes that he absolutely cannot. Um, and he completely falls into despair because he realizes that he has committed a sin, a crime, so to speak, against the natural order, because he feels it in his heart. This isn't so much a logical or rational um, belief; it's one that he feels intuitively deep down that he has killed someone made in the image of God. And so, I think that's what makes Crime and Punishment such a powerful book, because you can tell an interesting story, a dramatic story, and be entertained by it. But Dostoevsky goes deeper. He asks these philosophical questions that make the story entertaining because they um, underpin what the foundation. They are the foundation, and it is through philosophy that true drama can actually spring. And so, to me, Crime and Punishment does a very good job at this. And then you have the other character whose name I can't pronounce at the time. At this time, I'm really sorry that I can't. Who was an employer of Raskolnikov's sister, who she ran away from, and then later on in the book, he tries to basically blackmail her and say, well, if you don't, if you're not going to be with me, then I will won't help your brother escape from his crime. And he is, I mean, and it's very likely that he killed his own wife so he could be with the sister. And so, and he is a complete. And one of the things that this deals with is that Crime and Punishment acknowledges the so-called Nietzschean impulse that exists within humanity, where he believes that he can just completely dominate through sheer force of will, through materialism, through selfishness, through the idea that power is all that really matters, and he almost seduces the sister of Raskolnikov into essentially submitting to him through sheer force of will. But he ultimately realizes at the last minute that his morality is so unsavory that he can't ultimately go through with it, and he ends up taking his own life, because that is the logical conclusion of such a philosophy. Because what I think what Dostoevsky is saying is that that Nietzschean impulse inside of us, what it is that it's ultimately the sin impulse, it's the animalistic impulse within us, but we're also called to a greater, more divine uh, um, frame of mind, and that is our holy impulses, which is what Raskolnikov comes to realize towards the end of the book. And so it's a very morally and it's a very morally complex book, Crime and Punishment, because it deals with these ambiguities um, in a way that is very dramatic and very powerful, and I love it for that reason. Um, I wish we had more books like this, but most books just try to entertain. They don't try to probe deeply on such matters. And so, what I love about Crime and Punishment is just how deep it goes into these philosophical questions. Even if you come out in a completely different place, or even if you have a completely different interpretation than I do, um, that's the impression that I get from the book, and or you can still have a rich philosophical experience even if you have a different impression than I do. But also, I try to deal with these themes in my own work. I try to deal with the deep philosophical themes surrounding morality. What's right? Can you have morality without God? What are the arguments for it? What are the arguments against it? Um, should society be liberal and open? Should it be more conservative? Um, these are questions that I deal with, and I often fall, not always, but I often fall somewhere in the middle. And because I believe that the best books deal with nuance, and they deal with exploring these deep philosophical themes in a very dark way, in a way that is true to life, where you can have hope, but it's mixed with darkness, because the greatest works of art always contemplate the notion of light and darkness, that dynamic. Which one should win in the end? Maybe none of them should win. Um, maybe maybe the best kind of art is the art that is the art that settles in twilight, or maybe light is the answer. Um, these questions artists have wrestled with for thousands of years, and I have my own thoughts on the topic. I do believe at the end of the day that despite the darkness in society, that that good will win out in the end, ultimately, not necessarily in every individual story. Some of my stories end very bleakly, but they always point to there being a hope, even if the characters in the situation are suffering in the moment, or even if many of them end up dying by the end. There's always a subtle hope, even if it seems like everyone is in despair by the end. Shakespeare dealt with this as well. Many of his stories seem like tragedy, but often there are still moral principles and ideals in those tragedies that still point to something higher and more transcendent. And so, to me, I love these philosophical questions, and I especially love them when they're done through poetry, where they're expressed through music, um, where they have and Dostoevsky is poetic more sparingly, but there are moments of it where the poetry can probe into deeper themes, and can reveal truths that sometimes can't be expressed through ordinary language. They can only be expressed to our intuitive selves. That's the purpose of music, and that's the purpose of poetry. So ultimately, I think the purpose of art as a whole is to engage with the deeper meanings within life, both aesthetically, morally, philosophically, musically, and I think Crime and Punishment does that quite well, which is why I would highly recommend it. Okay, so I hope you enjoy listening to this rant. Again, if you would like to support this channel, my books are linked in the description section. And until next time, goodbye.